Okay, well, I can see that we're approaching not a full house exactly, but we've got most of the people in, and there'll still be others, and they can join us while we get underway. So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this, the next in our series of HESES trainings this year. And this, as you can see, in this one, we will be talking about categorizing your students and looking at important definitions around this whole subject. So as usual, first of all, let's do a little bit of housekeeping, just so we all know where we are. My name is Roger Lear. Some of you may have been here on Monday. And this time I'm going to be backed up by my colleague Will Scott if my link were to go down. And again, Ross Lawler, my colleague, will be answering questions as we go through and at the end of the session. As before, closed captions are available. Click on the CC icon. And again, as before, this session is being recorded. And that recording will be available via the OFS website. And you'll be able to check back and look at it and pass it on to any of your colleagues who may not have been able to attend. And as before, the intended audience is very much those new to HESES, or those perhaps who are coming back for a refresher. And we are, of course, here as much as anything here to answer your questions about HESES. So you can do that via the Q&A box in Zoom. Please don't use the chat box unless you want to talk to our event staff about anything at all. That's more for the sort of admin side of things rather than for questions. We should have time, we hope, for all of the questions, but we'll see how we go. We are scheduled for 90 minutes today, and we've got some flexibility over this, but you know, if we finish early, then all the better. And as before, we will be sending an evaluation form to participants who've agreed to receive one, but we won't be doing that until after the last of these events, the fourth event, has concluded. In the meantime, if there is anything you want to tell us about these events, then please write to us at events@officefordstudents.org.uk. So let's just put this session in its place in terms of the other things that are going on. You can see here I bolded today's session on this slide. We've got a couple of others to come after this on Monday next week and Wednesday next week. And as we said before, you're going to have to register for each of these that you want to attend, and details of how to do that can be found on the events page of our website, officefordstudents.org.uk/events. And you'll also find there details about the hands-on workbook exercise and breakout groups that we do. And these will take place in the beginning of October, but as I said before, unfortunately, they're full already. So we do have wait lists for those. So if that's still of interest, then go to the web page that you can see there, and you'll be able to find out more about them. In terms of other materials which you might find useful, as usual, as I've just said, there will be a recording which will be available on that page, officefordstudents.org.uk/events. And although it may take a day or two, the slides from today's presentations will also be made available there. And the best starting point for you to look at in terms of more or less anything HESES related is this webpage, officefordstudents.org.uk/HESES. Your main resource is likely to be what we call the guidance document, and that's got its own special web page, officefordstudents.org.uk/publications/HESES21. So you can find it there. Other useful things, there's the how to complete the HESES21 workbook publication, which is making its way through the final approval process. It's still not available yet, I'm afraid, but it will be soon. And there are also some useful videos on our YouTube page, youtube.com/officefordstudents. And I mentioned this last time, but it's always worth mentioning. The guide to funding is another really useful background piece of documentation. Again, the latest edition is not quite ready to go, but it will be very soon. And for all of the pending publications, the best way of staying on top of that is to sign up for our email alerts at this web page here, officestudents.org.uk. Sign up for email alerts, all hyphenated, and that way you'll keep on top of everything that is being released. So let's have a look at what we're going to do today. Rather an interesting list of things here. Essentially, what we're talking at today is, or what we're going to look at today is, initially we're going to have a look at the HESES21 workbook. Only a brief look because it's something which we will spend a lot of time investigating, both through this seminar and particularly the next one that we've got coming up. We're going to investigate what we mean when we talk about the HESES21 population. And then most of this session today is going to be devoted to how we categorize students. And that can be by mode, level of study, length of year. This is in no particular order: price group, fundability status, domicile, and whether or not students are new entrants. So let's start moving and get to look at the first of these, the HESES21 workbook, which is sort of where all the numbers go. Now, a lot of you may have seen this before, but if you haven't, this is a picture of the title page of the workbook itself, and obviously it'll be customized for you when it's released. And we'll look at more of the tables in this as we go. But first, let's just ask the question, what does the HESES workbook actually do? Whoops, sorry, must I move on to the next slide? There it is. What does the HESES workbook do? What's it for? It gives us an early indication of the number of higher education students studying in the academic year 2021-22, and does this by categorizing students. And as I say, that's the focus of today's webinar, and then counting them in their different categories. And that's the focus of the next session next week. So this brings us on to consider what's referred to as the HESES population, the HESES21 population. But before we look at this closely, I just want to talk about the unit of measure that we use. So another way looking at this is to ask, what is actually recorded in HESES? Okay, HESES counts what we call years of instance, which begs the question, what do we mean by an instance? Well, an instance is defined as a coherent engagement with a provider by a student aiming towards the award of one or more qualifications or of credit. This is usually a course, but not always. It could be several years long, but it could be just 1 year or possibly even less. And certain circumstances, progressing from one related course to another is considered to be one instance. An example here is the sort of thing which happens with foundation degrees a lot of the time. People then go on to top up, as it were, to a bachelor's degree of some kind. Important point to talk about here is that counting years of instance is not the same as counting student headcount. This is going to become more apparent as we go through, but one of the things that the danger here is that you might distort part-time study activity. So we'll look into this a bit more in the next webinar when we consider something called FTE, full-time equivalents. Occasionally, it's possible for one student to, there's a slight typo on the slide there, sorry about that, for one student to generate more than 1 year of instance, although this is particularly rare. So the HESES guidance actually gives an example of a first year of an undergraduate degree course of students starting in September 21, and then perhaps in March, they might go on to a part-time HNC with the same provider. That kind of thing is unusual, but it's just worth mentioning here in case it ever comes up. Okay, so now we know that our measure is this thing called years of instance. So let's consider what we use it to measure. In other words, who do we include in HESES21? This diagram is taken from the HESES21 guidance, and we'll take it from the top down. At the top, we have all the students associated with a provider. Of these, some, in fact, probably most, will be included in the HESES population, but because HESES is only counting higher education activity, you can imagine scenarios where we're not interested in all the students at a provider. For example, further education colleges that also teach higher education courses, well, we wouldn't want to count all their further education students. Those that are included, the definitions for those to be included are in Annex A and Annexes A and B of the HESES guidance. And the criteria for this are summarized in our next slide. So students must be aiming for a recognized higher education qualification or for higher education level credit that can be counted towards one. They've got to be registered with a provider and actively pursuing studies in the 21-22 academic year. And they must be spending no more than half the active study time for their whole instance outside the UK. Okay, so one thing which I'm going to mention here, because I was chatting with somebody a few months ago, and they were under the misapprehension that HESES is only for people starting their studies. It is not, it's for all years of instance that start in 21-22, not just those starting their courses in that time. So just looking back at the first bullet here, before we go any further, we have to determine what we mean by recognized higher education. So to do this, we turn to the HESES guidance, where we find a definition in Annex B, and it derives from the Higher Education and Research Act 2017, HERA, as we refer to it, which we talked about in the first webinar. Now, the top half here, I won't read this, and it's supplemented by the second paragraph here. Apologies to those that rely on the audio, but this is rather dense and complicated language, which is in the HESES guidance in Annex B, and I suggest that you go and look at this. But the text here is important because it's here to emphasize that there is a list, a specific list of what qualifications are included in the HESES population, and that it's defined by reference to legislation. Okay, both these pieces reference the Education Student Support Regulations of 2011 and the Education Reform Act of 1988. So that's the link to the legislation. In practice, this largely includes pretty much all degree qualifications, bachelor's, master's, and other postgraduate qualifications, foundation degrees as well, and things like high national certificates and diplomas. Some other types of qualifications, such as certain professional qualifications, are not included. So if you're not sure about this, you can contact the funding round team to help you. So returning to our original hierarchical diagram, at the second level, we've now established who is in the HESES population, those aiming for a recognised higher education qualification or credit, registered with a provider and studying in 21-22 and spending no more than half their active study for the whole instance outside the UK. But even this may include some years that we don't want to count. So moving down to the highlighted box here, we now need to work out what to include in the HESES 21 survey, and this is defined in Annex C of the guidance, and you will find the criteria there. And I'll run through them briefly. I won't dwell on these because we will be talking a lot more about the actual counting of years of instance in this and the next webinar. But briefly, to be counted, years of instance in 21-22 must meet all these criteria. Fee must be charged. And again, I'm just giving you the headlines here. So again, refer to Annex C for more detail. The full-time equivalence, the FTE, must be at least 0.03. And the student is not writing up throughout the entire year. This is a reference to things like writing up dissertations or theses and that type of stuff. And finally, the student has not withdrawn or is not forecast to withdraw within the two weeks of starting their instance. Okay, so there will be more about how to actually count years of instance in the next webinar. Okay, so just to backtrack briefly to one of the previous slides, where I'm just going to bring it back, and you'll see that I've highlighted this part here, which talks about registration. We said that students must be registered with a provider, and it's worth just spending a minute or two talking about what we mean by registered with a provider. So students should only be returned in HESES 21 and other student returns for that matter by the provider that they are registered with. This is the provider which has the full contractual responsibility to the student for the provision of educational services. In other words, the registering provider is the one that has tuition fees paid to them, usually by the student loan company. The students on apprenticeships, this is the same as the lead provider for the Education and Skills Funding Agency, the ESFA. In other words, the provider that receives the apprenticeship funding from them. And I'll come back to apprenticeships in a moment. Again, further guidance on this. I'm going to say this a lot today. Further guidance is in the guidance document, including particularly stuff about joint courses and exchange students, and that's in Annex A. Connected with this concept of registration is the idea of validation and subcontracting. So where providers are in partnership, this could be through what's known as a validation arrangement, where awards are made or validated by another provider, hence the name, that has degree awarding powers. And the student is registered with a teaching provider who will report them in its data returns. Alternatively, you might have a subcontractual arrangement, sometimes referred to as a franchise arrangement, where a student is not registered with the teaching by the teaching provider. The teaching provider is teaching on behalf of the registering provider. In other words, the teaching is being subcontracted to them. So in this case, the teaching provider does not report the students. And again, further information on this is in Annex A of the guidance. Okay, so whilst talking about registration, we can take the chance to make a few points about apprenticeships, because some students may be taking their higher education qualification as part of an apprenticeship. They should be registered with and reported by the lead provider. That's the one usually contracted by the ESFA, and we would normally expect them to be part-time. Okay, although occasionally there are exceptions to this. We're about to start talking about students' mode of study, so in a way we're just jumping the gun slightly for this. But for apprenticeships, only activity that directly contributes to their recognised higher education qualification should be counted towards a student's study activity. We don't expect this to include all the apprentice's time in the workplace, so that will be the activity that goes towards determining a student's mode of study, part-time, full-time, whatever. Again, we're jumping ahead a little bit here, but higher education and apprenticeships is very often tied to employees of a particular company, which might make them what we would call, or might make the course what we call a closed course. But because they're apprenticeships, we do not treat them as such, which would have funding implications if they were. The bottom line here is that apprenticeship students are reported in HESES pretty much the same as other students. Okay, we've had quite a lot on the start here, so I'm going to pause briefly and hand over to Ross just to see if we've got any questions which need answering at this point. So Ross, are you there?
Hi, Roger. Yes, we've had one question in so far, which is just, so the question has asked about, so you mentioned on slide 11, I think it was, where we mentioned that in some rare cases, a student can be on more than 1 year of instance at the same time. And so this is something which can happen. It is, as we say, rare. It would be, for example, where a student might be taking a course, so they might be doing a bachelor's degree with you, and then separately they're also at the same time pursuing another course or a module which leads to credit, which would be an instance which cannot count towards that particular, towards their main course. So they may be pursuing, say, an engineering degree, and they're doing that as a bachelor's, and at the same time through your provider they are taking credits which might lead towards a language qualification, for example, which can't count towards the main degree. In that situation, they could be considered to be on two separate instances. It can get slightly more complicated if there is a chance that the credits can count towards the main degree. If you think this is a situation which you're in, please contact us. We'll be happy to talk through these. It's always something we're happy to do if you want to talk about specific questions which you might have about sort of the edge cases around your provision. And while I've been talking about that, we've had a few more questions which have come in. So let me just have a look at the next ones that have come in. So one question is around, please clarify if we include closed course apprenticeships. So we don't consider apprenticeships to the closed course rule to apply to apprenticeships. It's one of the specific things that we mention in the guidance. So closed courses, as Roger sort of has talked about, is something where you have to be an employee of a particular provider to take that course. That particular rule does not count when we're considering apprenticeship. So apprenticeship can be closed and can still be recorded in HESES. It can still count towards HESES. We've had a question about where the guidance can be found for 2021. That is published on our website. If you go to the publications section of the OFS website, I think it is currently one of the top 3 things that we've published. We published a couple of other things today. We will provide a link to that. I think it will be placed in the chat, or we will be once we're finished talking to you. And there will also be links available to through various parts of our website as well. I have a question here about validation arrangements. So the question is saying they teach via a validation arrangement, but are not OFS registered yet. So the students register with a large university and they're asking if they need to complete HESES. So you do not need, in that situation, to complete HESES for those students because they belong. Actually, no, hold on a second. Let me just check something. I might need you to clarify this because we said validation arrangement here. Sorry, I know that I'm trying not to leave it blank. So this may be something that we might want to get into separately to clarify some details of this. It might be the sort of thing that's best to check, that we are clear on the details over email and then get back to you. So I'd suggest that provider, that attendee email us so we can discuss it in more detail. But in general, if it's a validation arrangement, as Roger said, then that means that those students belong to you. So we are talking, when we're saying registered, we have a specific meaning. So you might be using register to mean that they are that students are sort of signed up, so they're recorded on your system. But we are very clear that when we're talking about HESES, we want to know about who the students are registered with in that sense of having contractual responsibility. So if it is a validation arrangement and the students are, in that sense, registered with you in that they belong to you, and they don't belong to the larger university, then you would be the one who would have responsibility for returning them on HESES. If you are not registered yet with us, then you don't complete HESES. So that might mean that these students are not reported in any provider's HESES. It is about, are they registered with you, and are you registered with us? And if it's neither of those two, then it may be that they don't get recorded. If you want to check on that with us, we can follow up with you on that. I'm aware that we probably want to limit the amount of time we're spending on questions now. We have 3 more sessions where we can answer questions throughout the rest of their presentation. And we're always happy to follow up on any questions which we don't get time for in this webinar. So we'll maybe take 1, possibly 2 more questions before I hand back to Roger. So we've got another one which is following up on the, well, it's in a similar vein to the question we just answered, which is from a further education college. So they're saying that they receive student finance for a subcontracted program which is awarded by a partnership university. Do we count the students in our population? So if this is a subcontractual arrangement, then the students are considered to belong to the university. This is probably something you would need to clarify. Again, this is something we want to check with you to make sure that we had the details correct. It is possible that some of the student finance will get to you, or you might be collecting it on behalf of the university. But if the program is being taught under a subcontractual arrangement and the students are registered with your partner university, they would be the ones that return them. But if necessary, please check the details with that, and it will help you offline. Okay, next question. I think the last one, which we'll talk about now, is we've had a question saying, if a student is progressing from a foundation degree to a top-up, why is the top-up not a new year of instance? And they note that they understand they're not a new entrant. It would be a new year of instance, but it wouldn't be a new separate instance necessarily. So this is something which cropped up in particular last year when we were dealing with the pandemic. So if you have a case like this, where you have a student who's on a foundation degree and they progress to, in the following year, to a top-up, it can be considered as all being part of one single engagement with your provider, one single instance, in that the foundation degree will also lead to the final learning aim of the bachelor's, which they'll be working towards on the top-up. So it's unlikely to be a huge issue for you when you're completing HESES, because they will have completed the years of instance for the foundation degree in a previous year, and then they'll be starting a new year of instance for the top-up. So it's unlikely that they will overlap. It's only if they do overlap there's likely to be an issue. So it's not so much that they are not a new year of instance, it's that they're not a new instance, a new engagement. I think I'm going to pass back to Roger now, and we will check to see which questions, if any, we haven't gotten through yet. Please keep the questions coming in, and we will come back to any more of those in about another 10 minutes or so. So I'll pass back to you, Roger.
Right, thank you, Ross. That's good. So now we're in a position where we know exactly who we should count in the HESES workbook and what our unit of measure is, so we're using the year of instance. So now we can start to look at the workbook and how we use it to put those numbers into the different categories that we need. So this is where we are here. So as you can see from this, there are several categories, and I've not put them all here, but this is just the ones we're going to look at in the next chunk. Let's start by looking at what we call mode. Now, at the highest level, we categorize by mode in separate tables in the workbook. So you can see that indicated here. We've ringed the three ones here: full-time, sandwich, and part-time, tables 1, 2, and 3. As to the other ones that you see here, the courses table on the left is only going to be visible for providers that are further education and sixth form colleges and academies. And we'll talk quite a lot more about that in the next webinar. Tables 4 and 5 and the variants of table 6 that you can see here are analysing the data in tables 1, 2, and 3 in different ways, and we should come to them either today or later in this series. So now let's talk about precisely what we do mean by mode of study. So the mode in which students study determines which table they're recorded on in the HESES workbook, and as you've seen, this can be full-time, which goes into table 1, sandwich year out, which goes into table 2, and part-time, which goes into table 3. And these are mutually exclusive, as you might imagine. And we'll just show here the other tables that are involved. You just saw a different view of them, but here's a list. And as I said there, the courses table is only going to apply to further education colleges and sixth form colleges and academies. So let's look at the various criteria for each of these three main modes. Full-time is where we're going to start. So for this, full-time fees are chargeable. Now, and we'll just say that fees can be waived, but there are restrictions on this. So check the guidance, and here we're in Annex H territory. Students are normally required to attend for at least 24 weeks in the year of instance. And when we say attend, we mean at the provider themselves or somewhere else, for example, as we were just discussing, a subcontracted location. And they have to undertake study, tuition, learning in the workplace, work placement or work placement for at least 21 hours a week. So this can include time spent on sandwich work placement if the year doesn't meet the criteria to be a sandwich year out. So we'll see how this works shortly. And we'll look at the next mode, which is in fact sandwich year out. So again, Annex H for details. So in this case, with the year of instance, sandwich year out, a reduced fee is chargeable. Year of instance includes a period of work-based experience. It will have to meet the definition given in the student support regulations or be an Erasmus Plus scheme year abroad, spent working, and needs to meet the time-based performance-based criteria in Annex H, which is to say should be no more than 10 weeks of full-time study in the year, or the total of all the time spent not in full-time study, such as work placement, goes over 30 weeks. As far as those go, the best thing to do here is to have a quick example, and there are other examples in Annex H, but let's just look at one of our own. So I've laid it all out here. So a student might do in their first year, for example, 15 weeks of full-time study and a 16-week placement. Now this mode, this year, will be classified as full-time because full-time fees are chargeable. They're required to attend for at least 24 weeks, and that attendance is study, tuition, learning in the workplace, or work placement. And you can see I've bolded the two key elements there, for at least 21 hours a week. So that's full-time year. The second year, 15 weeks of full-time study plus 60-week placement. This would be a sandwich year out because the total time so far not in full-time study is greater than 30 weeks. So it meets that last criterion we were looking at on the previous screen. So you've got the two 16-week placements there, making 32, taking it over the 30-week threshold. Again, Annex H is really the place to go. If a year doesn't meet the definitions for full-time or sandwich year out, then for HESES purposes, it's considered to be part-time. Now, just to recap what we said earlier about mode of study, apprenticeship students are normally part-time. They can be full-time in certain circumstances, but again, you may want to check with us. For the purposes, though, of determining a student's mode of study, as I said before, only time spent in study or learning in the workplace that directly contributes to their recognised higher education qualification should be counted towards the student's activity. We don't expect this to include all the apprentice's time in the workplace. Okay, so just moving on a little further, there are one or two other things to note about mode. It is possible you may get students changing mode from time to time, and that again is not common, but it's detail which is addressed in Annex H. And also, HESES version of full-time may not quite jive with the HESES version of full-time, and this is, again, this is unusual, but it does happen occasionally, particularly where you get courses of about 50 months length. And typically what that means is that the first year of instance will be full-time, and then you might find the second year, which would be the last 3 months, is going to be less than that 24 weeks in that year of instance, which according to the HESES is going to make that part-time, but because you're studying at full-time intensity, it's full-time in HESES terms. Now there is a way around this in terms of how to code things on HESES using mode equals O2. If this applies to you, if you think this applies to you, check out Annex H, as I say, or get in touch with us and we can give you a bit more on this one. So that's a lot on mode of study. We'll have a quick check-in with Ross again for questions, see if there's any more on this. So over to you, Ross.
Thank you, Roger. Yes, we've had a couple of questions in. The first one is we've got two questions which we're going to take together. So the first question was about asking for more detail on how the concept of year of instance works for January starts or for starts later in the year. And another question, which is which I'm going to take at the same time, which is about asking if a student attends for more than 2 weeks but then withdraws or suspends study before the 1st of December, should they be included in HESES21? And these are actually things which are going to be covered in our next webinar. When we get to the webinar next Monday, where we're talking about counting students, there will be more detail and some examples on how year of instance works, particularly for things like January starts, and also about how whether students should be recorded in HESES if they have withdrawn. So I'm going to suggest that to those two attendees that they watch the webinar next week, as we'll go into it then. And if you still have any questions, then we'll come back to those questions then, if that's okay. Moving on to other questions, we've had a couple of questions around full-time, the full-time mode, and how that works when students may not always be attending on site. So the first question is about full-time students and asking if they have courses that are blended learning, so they are still meeting the time-based criteria, but they're not always on site. Do they count as full-time? And another question, I'm not sure if this is a follow-up or not, because it's from and also from an anonymous attendee saying that their students are full-time but do 1 week solid teaching followed by assignments. So does the assignment count as attendance in that case? So certainly the definition of full-time can include students who are studying by distance learning as well. You will be best placed to be able to make realistic assessments of how much time they are actually studying while they are away from you. It's possible you might want to ask further questions about that after you've submitted your HESES workbook. We may sort of just follow up with you to just sort of clarify the learning pattern that they are doing. But certainly blended learning and distance learning can count towards full time. It does not just have to be limited to the amount of time that they are spending on campus. And indeed, the definition of full time does include an allowance for time which students are spending on independent learning. So the answer is yes, they can certainly count towards that. I'm going to look for the next question, which is, so we have a question here about a student who is on a final year, who's not been able to complete their final assessment on one or more modules, who continues past their end date into the next year with tuition to complete their qualifications. So they're asking if this counts as a qualification, they're asking if this would be recorded in HESES as a year of instance. It certainly can be. I mean, you've noted that they are doing more than the minimum FTE, and they're certainly doing more than the minimum amount of active study. So yes, yeah, it absolutely can be recorded. The fact that you are not charging fees is not a problem. The fee can be waived in certain circumstances, and indeed you could consider that because they are retaking modules, the fees already been paid in a previous year. I mean, if you want to check on this with us by email so that we know we've got all the details correct, please do, but it certainly sounds like they can generate a year of instance for HESES. I have a question here about what mode would be recorded for an HNC part-time when they are doing the course for 2 years. I think we may need more detail on that. I suspect it probably would be part-time. If that's part of the question. We've had some issues with HNCs in the past where they haven't quite met the definition of full-time in terms of time-based criteria. So you might have someone who is doing an HNC over 1 year, so having an effective FTE of 1, they're doing a 1-year course over 1 year, but they aren't quite studying enough. The amount of time they're spending studying doesn't quite meet our definition of full-time. So it is possible to have the occasional odd case where you might have a student who's studying part-time with an FTE of 1. FTE is a concept that we will talk about more in our next webinar, if it's not something you're familiar with. We have got a couple more questions which have come in, so I'll just have a look at these. Again, I'm aware we don't want to hold up the webinar too long, so we'll maybe do these last 2 questions, and then I'll pass back to you, Roger. So this question is how to categorize mode of study if a student completes all studies for the whole year within 17 weeks. That would be part-time. If they don't meet our definition of full-time, both those 2 time-based criteria, then they would be part-time. How will this apply to April starts? Are they part-time? So this is again something which you may want to come back to after watching our next webinar, because when you have this relates to some of the differences between recording students in HESES and recording students in HESES or the ILR. So when we are recording students in HESES, we do come back to this concept of a year of instance. And one of the things that we will talk about on Monday is that the year of instance does last for a year. So if you have students who are starting in April 2020, so we go back a year, their year of instance that started last April 2020 would extend to April 2021. And similarly, when you are looking at them for the purposes of HESES 21, you'll be looking at their year of instance starting in April 21 and extending to April 22. So they will always be you're always looking at a whole year's worth of potential activity. So as I said, we will get into this more on Monday, but they may not be part-time, they may be full-time, because you have to consider all the activity they are doing between when they start in April to August, so to the end to the end of July, to the end of that academic year. But then you will also be looking at all the activity they do from August through to April. So they will be doing, there will certainly be, it's not just a couple of months, it's a full 12 months worth of activity that you'll be looking at. It's the sort of thing which you may want, as I said, we'll look at the webinar that we'll be running on Monday. And then if you have any further questions about this, because it can be tricky, please email us. Right, I'm going to pass back to you, Roger, and we will do more questions in another 10 or 15 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Ross. And I realise that I should have put that slide up while we're asking you the questions, so sorry about that. So let's press on then. To recap, at the highest level, we've got separate tables in terms of categorising students. We've got separate tables which split them by mode. And then within each of those, we're going to further categorise students by these attributes: price group, length of year, level of study, fundability status, and domicile. Before we look at what these all mean individually, let's take just a big picture view of one of the workbook tables, and you can see how this all fits. So this is an example of table 1. Full-time students only would be recorded on table 1. There are equivalent tables for sandwich year out students in table 2, and part-time students on table 3, which has actually got a little bolt on for FTEs. And these tables are, but otherwise these tables are structured in the same way with the same headings, which we'll be discussing on the following slides. So what we're going to do initially is to zoom in on price groups. And as you can see, that's Annex G in the guidance. So let's look at this then. What do we mean by this? Well, years of instance are assigned to one of 6 price groups, reflecting the costs associated with particular subjects. So here's a list, and this is not entirely comprehensive, but it will give you an idea. Just running through them. Price group A is for the clinical years of medical, dental, and veterinary courses. Price group B is for laboratory-based subjects such as chemistry, engineering, certain healthcare courses. C1 is split now from this year into C1.1 and C1.2. And the first of these is for strategically important intermediate cost subjects, such as pre-registration courses in nursing, computing, information technology, and as it says here, archaeology. C1.2 is for other intermediate cost subjects covering provision in performing and creative arts, media studies, and so on. C2 is for subjects with other laboratory, studio, or fieldwork element. Some examples there of the kind of thing you might see: geography or languages or psychology. And price group D is largely classroom-based subjects. And again, a few examples there: politics, economics, law, English, history, so on. And these are used in determining and calculating grants for various funding allocations, which we could go into in chapter and verse, but we've got plenty to talk about today, so we will leave that for another day. So we've got to decide how to choose the correct price group. And basically, we're going to look at the ways of doing this. There are 2 specific cases, as they're called, and according to a coding system, and the coding system varies depending on the type of provider involved. So for further education colleges, FECs, further education colleges, sixth form academies, colleges and academies that use this Learn Direct Class system, the LDCS. Everybody else uses the Higher Education Classification of Subjects, HECOS codes. And again, there's a full description in the HESES guidance in Annex G. Now, this is important to get right because apart from anything else, we want to get an accurate picture of your provision, and this might get queried in the data validation verification rather that goes on after your HESES return is submitted. So let's just look, spend a little bit of time on these 2 specific categories that I've outlined here. First of all, specific cases. There are certain specific cases where the price group is predefined. So These are shown here: sandwich years out, clinical years of medical, dental and veterinary courses, pre-registration courses in nursing, midwifery and allied healthcare, and in social work, and initial teacher training courses. Again, Annex G is a place to go for the works. If a course does not fall into one of those categories, the price group is determined by reference to one of these sets of codes that we talked about, LDCS or HECOS. So let's have a look at those. So as we saw a moment ago, further education colleges use, sorry, my notes are just catching up here. Further education colleges use LDCS codes, and these are associated with the recorded learning aim of the course. And what's nice is that the courses table, which only appears in workbooks for further education colleges, maps the learning aim reference to the correct price group. It actually has a lookup, and you can see an example here from the courses table. And this is something which makes it a lot easier. You also see a higher level mapping in Annex G as well. You can also use the ESFA search website. They're referring to this as FALA, Find a Learning Aim. So it's find a learning aim beta.fast.org.uk. And that's the website where you could go. Now, the important thing here as far as LDCS codes goes, because of the link to the courses table, is that if you're setting up a new course, it would be good if you could get a learning aim reference from the ESFA as soon as possible, because otherwise, if there's a delay, that can complicate things. There are ways of dealing with this. For anybody who's done HESES before, they may know about temporary learning aims, so there are ways around this, but it's much nicer for all concerned if you can get this sorted out with the ESFA as soon as possible. For other providers, we're looking at HECOS codes. Now, these are administered by the Higher Education Statistics Agency, HESA, and they produce guidance for assigning HECOS codes to courses. That's hesa.ac.uk/support/documentation/HECOS, HECOS. And the HECOS codes to be used are determined by you, the providers. And I think the salient guidance here is from their documentation. It says the qualification subjects must represent directly or relate very closely to the wording on the qualification's official certificate of award. More than 3 qualification subjects would generally be regarded as exceptional. So this last part here is interesting because it's what it's referring to. It's the fact that you might have activity, study activity, which spans different price groups. So let's have a look at this kind of concept here. If you've got this sort of situation, you're going to have to work out what the split is. So it's split between price groups reflecting how much activity is done in each, based on the course as a whole. That is to say, each year would have the same split of price groups. The best way to illustrate this is with a quick example. So I'm going to use a HECOS-based example for this. Here's an example of type of course, physics with maths over 3 years, and it's associated with these 2 HECOS codes. The first one maps to price group B because it's to do with physics, and the second one is C2, which is where a lot of the mathematics falls. So here's a breakdown of how the different years work out. In the first year, 60% on physics, 40% on maths, 40% in the second year on physics, 60 on maths, and then in the third year, 80% on physics and 20% on maths. And hopefully the maths that is being taught there helps people work out that the average over the 3 years is 60% on maths and 40% on mathematics, sorry, 60 physics and 40 on math. So in HESES, for all the years of instance involved here, you'd use the 60-40 split because it applies over the entire length of the course. All years of instance will be recorded with that split, first, second, or third. Okay, so I think we've had a good look at price groups now. So moving on, going back to our workbook, that we looked at earlier. Let's see now what we've got to next, and it's the category here that I've circled for length of course. And you can see the mauve shaded area of the workbook from this, and you can see that we're looking at long and standard years of instance. And as the caption says there, this is gone into in Annex J of the guidance. So this is recorded because the distinction is made because it can feed into an element of teaching funding for either accelerated full-time undergraduate provision or intensive postgraduate provision, for which different funding rules might apply. It's best to look at, first of all, at what is a long year, because everything that's not a long year is a standard year. So let's have a look at this. Full-time is one thing here, where a student is in attendance for 45 weeks or more in the year of instance. There are some restrictions here though. Periods of work experience don't count in this case, and sandwich years out don't count, and usually foundation years don't count either. The other possibility is part-time, and this depends on the length of the equivalent full-time course. And there are quite a lot of ins and outs here, and in the sort of overview like this, it's too much to go into. So again, I'm going to refer you to Annex J for details. But with all of that in terms of the definition of long years, what we can then say is that standard length years are those that are not long years. Okay, if it's not a long year, it's a standard length year. Okay, back to the workbook, and what we're going to look at now is level of study, which is here. And you can see here in the green part of the workbook there that there are a number of different categories here. And this is something, what you'll see on the next slide is something which I know that a lot of people expect in presentations. So for those that you're expecting a cat picture, there it is. In terms of level of study, this is determined in relation to qualifications needed to enter a course. So as you'd expect for undergraduates, there's no degree level entry requirement. So we have that. But then for postgraduate taught is the first thing we've got here. The normal entry requirement to this is a degree level qualification. Now, there are actually some sub-levels to this, and we'll look at those again in a moment, but we'll just mention them here. PGT undergraduate fee, PGT master's loan, and PGT other. Just to dot I's and cross T's, you might see PGR mentioned, postgraduate research, where the qualification aim is a research-based degree. You might see this in the workbook, but it's only used for planning purposes. It's not in connection with the finance arrangements. So that's just to make that clear. So let's just look a little bit closer at PGT. And as I said before, the normal entry requirement is a degree level qualification. And we've got these three sub-levels. So PGT UG fee is only for certain postgraduate certificates in education or architecture and pre-registration courses in nursing, midwifery and allied health professions, or NMAR as it's sometimes known. So not a terrifically wide field there, but obviously there will be people with that kind of stuff. Probably most will fall into this category, PGT master's loans. The thing about this is that this is a characteristic of the course rather than the student. So if somebody's on a course and they haven't actually taken out a loan, then it is still, because it's a characteristic of the course, this is still going to be a PGT master's loan. And then PGT other is everything else which is not in that category. So again, this is all referred to in great detail in Annex I of the guidance. So please look at that for further details. So once again, it's time for questions. So Ross, over to you.
Thank you, Roger. Sorry, I was just looking at another question, so I was slightly slower turning my camera back on then. Yeah, so you had several questions. So the first question is slightly to a degree following up on the question on the slides we had on mode. So we've had a question asking that if the provider has to report students part-time on HESES for courses which are funded as full-time, will that have an effect on their student loans? I'm not aware that it will do, no. there are some differences between how things are categorised in HESES and how they're categorised by the Student Loans Company. What concept called ELQ, equivalent to lower qualifications, which we'll talk about in our next webinar, for example, is handled differently. So no, I'm not aware that there would be an impact. Some questions about price groups. So we've been asked if there is a definitive list of course titles and HECOS codes in the guidance. We don't necessarily give you a definitive list of HECOS codes, but we do have a map in that sense, or course titles. We do have a mapping which is available, which maps both LDCS codes and HECOS codes to price groups, which follows up, which matches with another question that we have, where somebody has noted that they have a particular learning aim reference and that they already determined that the LDCS code for that is one starting MA.11, and they want to know how they would determine what price group that is. So if you go to the HESES guidance, we will provide in there. There is a link to to the document that we've published, which shows the that mapping. It is also available if you want to download it separately, and we'll try to put this link into the into the chat. We published a document back at the beginning of August called Data Collection to Inform Funding for 22-23 Notification of Changes. So this set out, before we published the full guidance, the changes that we were intending to make to HESES for this year. As part of that, we attached an annex to that document, which contains a mapping of LDCS and HECOS codes to price groups. So if you know your HECOS codes or you know your LDCS codes, you can use that to match up the particular one. You can use them to match them up to price groups. If you are a further education college, you have a slightly different version of the workbook. We will talk about this a bit more in our next webinar. Sorry to keep saying this, but it is something that we will be covering next time, where you have an extra table called the courses table, which you can use to look up what the learning aim reference for your courses, and you can see what price groups that matches up to. So when we have our webinar next week, we'll go into that in a bit more detail. So there is kind of a shortcut there where you can match up specific learning aims to price groups as well. Okay, the next question, still on price groups, is please can you confirm how further education colleges are priced? As the slide suggests, this is by LDCS codes, but the college in this example has noted that their higher education programs are validated by a partner university, and during validation they're required to confirm HECOS codes on their module records. That may just be to do with the way that the system, the relationship is set up with your partner university. If you are responsible for returning these students, they are registered with you, so that if this is a validation arrangement, then you are returning them in HESES. Then we will be looking to use LDCS codes for this, because we would match the course aim. Because you return data on these students to the ESFA via the ILR, even though they are doing HE programs, you still return your data to the ESFA. We would be looking at the LDCS codes attached to those particular course aims. So the university would not be, or should not be, using HECOS codes to return these students a second time to us. That's one of the things we would pick up during our data validation part of HESES. So I suspect it's probably more to do with their internal processes than it is to do with anything to do with their funding. We have a question about price group splits. So this is a question that we've had where someone has asked about whether they should include the level 3 part of a 4-year course, which includes a foundation year. And you certainly can do. When you're determining the price group splits, it may not make much of an effect, but it's part, if it's part of the whole course, then that's fine. Moving away from price groups, I'll look at some of the questions we've had in while I've been talking. Someone's asked to put a link in the chat for the mapping document, which I think that our event support people have already done so. Someone has asked about full-time masters and PhD courses and asked if these are usually long. The answer is yes, usually, but you should still check. you would need to, we would want you to make sure that you have looked at the amount of activity they are doing to make sure they meet their time-based criteria. It's not a given that they will always be long, but as you say, they may usually be long, but you should still make sure that that information is recorded somewhere so that you can check it rather than assuming that they'll be long. So here's a question here. Please, can you let us know if HNDs would be put in D? I'm presuming that's price group D, and under undergraduate. They certainly would be undergraduate. I can't tell you that they will be price group D because that will depend on the subject. So then, you know, if you're doing an HND in engineering, it may very well be price group B. If you're doing an HND in something like business, then it could be, then it would be price group D. So we would need to know the subjects involved to be able to confirm the price group to you. I don't think I've got any more questions noted here. I will just have a quick check to see if any, scroll down and see if anything new has come in. I think that's the last question we've had there. So I will pass back to you, Roger.
Okay, thank you, Ross. And so we can press on, though we're on the last couple of laps now. So let's move on to see what we've got left. We need to look at these things in order to get the end of the list of classifications. We're going to talk now about fundability, status, and domicile. We're going to briefly consider new entrants and the other classifications that we've got. So just going back to our picture of table 1, we're looking now at fundability status right at the end there. And fundability status is dealt with in Annex F. So here, what we're doing is separating out, we're using this picture here to separate out higher education activity that is fundable by the OFS and a provider. And this revolves around what fees the students are entitled to pay. Okay, so as you can see, this is split between those students entitled to pay home fees and those from overseas. So next. How are these terms defined? Well, basically it breaks down like this. Home fee is defined by fee regulations. Now this includes those from the Crown dependencies, which is to say the Channel Islands and the Isle of Man, and may also include some EU students covered by the withdrawal arrangements. Check the government guidance linked to in the HESES21 guidance in Annex F there. Basically then everybody falling outside of this is overseas. Everything falling outside of the home fee status is overseas. And although we don't fund overseas students, they are included in HESES, so that, you know, we still need to count them. Again, as I keep saying, Annex F is a place to look for here, that basically the fee regulations it refers you to. And again, I haven't put this on the slide, but I'll read it. It's the Education Fees and Awards England Regulations 2007, Statutory Instrument 2007, number 779, as amended. So this is just to make the point finally here that the HESES21 guidance is not definitive. This relies on the fee regulations. That's what guides us in this scenario here. So going back to our diagram, remember what we're trying to decide on here is whether student study activity is fundable by the OFS. And to do that, we've looked at fee status. So now we're looking at home fee students, and now we need to work out exactly which parts of this study activity is fundable and which are not. So basically, we can summarize things like this. Home fee students, unless they're in one of the categories which I'm about to show you, are OFS fundable. So here is the list, or well, it's not a complete list, but again, this is the main highlights. And again, Annex F is a place for the full list. These are the non-fundable categories, and some of these we've touched on already, things like postgraduate research, initial teacher training, learning to QTS, which I think is qualified teacher service, and EYTS, early years teacher status. INSET is in-service training. There are various other things here, certain courses commissioned and funded by the NHS, PGT sources, students funded by other public source, students on closed courses, except for those on apprenticeships, which was talked about before. and students aiming for equivalent or lower qualifications, ELQs. Now, Ross did mention that, and I'll come back to those in just a moment. And I've got this last bulletin here. It's unlikely to apply, but again, it's detailed. Some health-related courses that were started before funding, or that had students starting on them, I should say, before funding was transferred from the Department of Health and Social Care. The penultimate bullet here really is the one which is probably going to be the most common exception here. So we're going to talk about this now. ELQs, equivalent or lower qualifications. When students are aiming for a qualification that is at the same level or lower than the one that they already have, then we're in ELQ territory. Generally, these are non-fundable, but there are some exceptions. And again, Annex F for the full list, but you can see the ones that I've mentioned here: foundation degrees, PGCEs, students if they're in receipt of the disabled students allowances, and a number of health-related courses as well. I think the key takeaway here is that if you don't know a student's prior qualifications, you should treat them as aiming for an ELQ, which is to say that they're non-fundable, unless it's exempt. If you've got students, again, this is one of those rare situations, if you've got students aiming for more than one qualification as part of the same course, which occasionally happens, then for ELQ purposes, you assess against the lower of the two qualifications. Now, this chart, which I think comes from the Quality Assurance Agency, can be useful in referring to this. And also, there is a nice flowchart in Annex F, which helps you work out what's going on here. So that's always worth referring to if you've got questions. Right, now we're working our way through our list, and while we're looking at this type of diagram, I'm going to start fringing into table 5, because that's where we come across this idea of domicile. That's one of the fields, and that fits into our hierarchy here. This also crops up in the courses table for further education colleges, so we'll just take a quick look at that. Domicile, we share a definition with the ILR or HESES domicile field, which is the country code of the student's permanent home address prior to entry to the course, not necessarily the correspondence address of the student. This applies to home fee students, and it can be UK domicile, which is where you're entitled to pay home fees, and your country of domicile is England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, or otherwise not specified in the UK, and other, which is the rest. So this is only something which you come across on table 5, and the planning table, which we're about to look at, and the courses table. So that's something which only FECs will see. So I mentioned table 5, I've kind of teased you with it, and let's have a look at it, because this is one of the others. We've concentrated on the way 1, 2, and 3 looks at the moment. Call the planning table because that's mainly what the data here is used for. And if I do this, you should see where the piece, the parts of it that refer to domicile come into play. But also, while we're looking at that, it's worth just pointing out that there are 2 sections in the planning table. Section A, and this kind of represents all the same numbers that we've had in tables 1, 2, and 3, but just analysed differently, as you can see here on the left. But also section B on the right here is headed new entrants, and it's convenient to look at that because it's something that we've talked about briefly, and it's the last of our classifications really today. So let's just talk briefly about new entrants. Again, this is something which I think gets touched on later, so this is by way of a preview. New entrants, we need to categorize these in table, section B of table 5, and the student is counted as a new entrant when they first generate a countable year for that instance. Probably they've not been active at the same broad level at that provider in either of the 2 previous academic years, and by the same broad level we mean undergraduate, postgraduate. and so on, as you can see there. So this doesn't include students who are repeating a year, but can include students entering directly into the second or subsequent years of a course. So again, full details are in the HESES guidance, this time in Annex C. So we'll have more on that as we go through the rest of the webinars. And just to complete the set, I'm going to mention here the other tables that we haven't yet referred to and see how they get classified. Table 4 is the one that deals with years abroad and obviously only applies to some providers. And when you get to look at it, I won't show it here. It's fairly self-explanatory, especially once you've seen the next webinar, in which the role of what we call column 1 and column 2 are explained, and there's plenty of stuff in the guidance. And then the others, which I've highlighted here, are what we refer to as the health tables, columns 6A, 6B, and 6C. And these record students on nursing, midwifery, and allied health profession courses. And we'll have more of these in the next webinar. But as you can see, they've got counterparts to tables 1, 2, and 3, in as much as you've got full-time, sandwich year out, and part-time. So I think we're at the point where we can go back to Ross again and see how we're doing for questions. So this is the last chance we'll have for questions today. So I'll hand over to Ross without any further delay.
Thank you, Roger. We have had a few questions. I am aware that we are getting quite close to the end of our time today, and there's a couple of just last slides that Roger will need to go through. So we will see how many we can get through before we have to draw to a close. But I would take the opportunity to remind everybody that if you do have any further questions, we're always happy to help if you want to email us. And I think one of the things that Roger will be doing in the last few slides is to provide those email addresses. So the first question is asking about that if PGR, so postgraduate research, is not fundable, why should there be PGR in the workbook under home fundable? And it's not actually possible to record PGR students that way. It is possible to record PGR students as home fee non-fundable, but the workbook has the cell for PGR home fundable grayed out, and you can't enter any data into that. So you have to choose whether they are either home, non-fundable, or overseas. It's not possible to record them as fundable. Another question is to do with PGCEs and fundability. So the question is, most teacher training students go for PGCE and QTS. One is fundable, one is not. How do we count them? So this is because there's two slightly different concepts here. So this is because there is the PGCE and initial teacher training gets mentioned under the categories which are considered non-fundable, but there's also it also comes up under the categories which may be exemptions from the Elq policy. So it's possible for a student or a student year of instance to be non-fundable for more than one reason. So the guidance notes that if you have students, and I will just make sure I'm quoting the right bit. I've copied the guidance up and open next to me. So the category, one of the categories is that students who are on initial teacher training courses leading to qualified teacher status or to early years teacher status, and also students who hold QTS and are on inset courses, are considered to be non-fundable. Those aren't necessarily the only initial teacher training courses that exist. So there are other courses that may not quite fall into that category. So for example, you can have initial teacher training courses which lead to QTLS. So that's, I think, qualified teaching and learning status. So that's more for the post-secondary sector, if I remember correctly. So in that case, they do not come under that. So in particular, the non-fundable category here is where you have students who are on courses leading to QTS or EYTS, and there may be some that don't fall into that. Separately to that, we also have a set of exemptions for the Elq policy, and that references students who are on a course of initial or in-service teacher training in any mode or level of study. So that doesn't specify to the same degree that it specifically applies to particular status, to QTS, QTLS, EYTS, for example. So if you have students who are doing, say, those QTLS qualifications, they don't come under the category which makes them non-fundable, which specifies QTS, but they are also exempt from the ELQ policy. So that might be one of those little details that you need to check on. If you have any sort of edge cases like that that you want to check with us, again, that's something we're quite welcome to talk through with you. Next question. So we have a question here about learners who completed their level 3 course in the 2021 academic year. Will they be counted as a new entrant for 21-22 doing an HNC level 4 course? Yes, so this is because they were studying they're studying at a different level now, effectively. They weren't studying a higher education course when they were doing their level 3 course in the 2021 academic year. So because they've started a new course, this is their first, if this is their first higher education course that they are doing with you within the last couple of years, it's quite possible they might have done a couple of these. But if it is the case that they did their level 3, that's their first engagement with you, and now they're coming back to do a level 4, they can be counted as a new entrant. Next question. There's one about the MEd qualification and whether this is not linked to being QTS fundable. I think we might have to deal with that one offline. So if you could email us about that one, I think that's probably something we'd want to get into separate to this webinar. We have a question about table 5. Please explain table 5 section B. Would that be the same figure used in the table, in table 1? So table 5 section B, we will be getting onto some of this in a bit more detail in the next webinar as well. But table 5 section B is in particular looking at new entrants. So this is not the same thing as necessarily table 1. So table 1, when you're saying table 1 there, I am assuming, I may be assuming this wrong, that you are talking about, say, the full-time tables, but you may also be meaning section A, the all years section on table 5. I mean, in either case, it's not quite the same thing, or it potentially could be if you're completely new. But for most of HESES, you are recording all of your students, whether they are new entrants or not. So you're recording your students who may be starting a course this year, but you're also returning students who are already in the middle of a course. It's only particularly on section B where you are specifically interested in recording ones who meet our definition of new entrants, which may or may not be quite the same as those who are starting their course. I think there's one more question, and then that would be the last one, which is, can a diploma in education and training level 4 be added to the collection as non-fundable? So I think this is probably to do with those concepts of fundability again. I think we would probably need to know some more details about the course. My instinct is to say that, well, it certainly could be non-fundable, but I think we'd need to understand why it was that you thought it should be recorded as non-fundable. So I think it's probably better to take that offline and deal with the question when we can get into the details of it. So I think that's the last question we've had in. So I will pass back to you, Roger, to finish the webinar.
Okay, Ross, thank you very much. And thank you all for your questions. And as Ross says, I'll talk in a moment to give you some contact details. So a couple of other things I want to just show you first. The first of these is a handy dandy summary of the annexes that we've talked about. You'll understand now how our catchphrases have you looked in the guidance document amongst ourselves, because this is where all of the good stuff is defined. And this table here shows you the various annexes that we've referred to today, the definition of the HESES population, recognition, definition of higher education for funding purposes, mode, all of these things that we've talked about, different classifications. So you can have a look at those at your leisure. And this then leads us on to just recap what we've looked at today. So we had a little look initially at the HESES workbook, and we've seen a snapshot of that as we've carried on throughout, and we'll be looking at that in much more detail in the remaining, or certainly in the next webinar. We talked about the HESES21 population, how it's defined, and most of the session we spent on looking at the different categories that we have for the count: mode, level of study, length of year, price group, fundability status, domicile, and new entrants, as I say, not in any particular order. So with some of these, we've had to sort of just give you a quick view, because some of them will need quite a deep dive, but I hope that you've had something at least from today that will give you a flavor of what is needed. You can, of course, go back and look at the recording of this webinar, which should be up in a day or so on the OFS events page. And as I say, the next webinar will also feed into and augment your understanding of what's going on here. That's going to be on Monday at 1:30 the same time, and the theme there is identifying and counting students to be included in HESES21. And as you can see, this is going to cover how to count student years, and that plays very much to some of the questions which Ross was talking about earlier about when years of instance start and so on. How to make forecasts on non-completion and full-time equivalents, which again, full-time FTE was something which got mentioned in passing today. And specifically, we'll be looking at the healthcare tables, which I talked about just towards the end there. Again, you'll need to register if you haven't already to be able to attend, and you can find out how to do that on our events pages. So here are a number of links which basically will get you moving in the right direction. officeforstudents.org.uk/HESES for all things HESES. The email address, HESES, HESES, at officeforstudents.org.uk, and that's the best place to get in touch with this initially when you've got questions about this. And our YouTube channel has interesting and useful stuff there as well, youtube.com/officeforstudents. So I think that has actually brought us to the very last slide. So thank you all for listening and watching. I hope that you found this useful, and we hope to see you all again on Monday next week. Thank you all very much.